Hey guys, welcome back to Introduction to Sociology with Dr. John. Today we're talking about small groups. And small groups are in many ways the foundation of social life because this is where we interact with people. We typically interact in a meaningful way with members of small groups that we form a part of. So small groups are particularly fundamental to the process of socialization. And again, if you follow micro sociological theories, then this is even more important. This is where most of that micro sociological activity takes place. Groups, again, provide an essential sense of belonging that people need. Now, we can belong in a sense to the country, to a religion, and these things are important in an abstract way, but how it becomes concrete for us is in the direct interpersonal relationship with other people. So for macro sociologists, groups and organizations provide the mechanism for placing the individual within social space and for reinforcing social norms. For micro sociologists, groups provide the mechanism for the negotiation and production of norms and values. So slightly different ways of looking at it, but in many ways there's a lot of overlap between these perspectives. So what is a group? So in the simplest way of putting it, any two or more people who feel united and have stable patterns of social interaction. So if you have two best friends, and you hang out on a regular basis, you're a group. People at work within the same workspace, assuming you feel united and you regularly interact within the work, you're a group. On the other hand, it may be that some people just come to work. You might have interaction with them, but if you don't really feel united with them, you're not a group. That doesn't mean something might happen the next day that might create the sense of a group. So groups can form, they can break apart, they can grow, they can shrink, and these things will occur, again, according to social necessity. Now, a group is different from an aggregate. An aggregate is a bunch of people who just interact on a very brief level. So, for example, if you walk from your home to work, you'll pass by a lot of people, but they're not part of a group with you. They're more of an aggregate. They're just a bunch of people who don't really know each other. And yes, you have brief interactions, and those interactions are regulated by social norms, but you're not yet a group. Category are people who have the same characteristics. So, for example, anybody with red hair, that would be a characteristic you have. Left-handed people, is that my left hand? I forget, okay. Blue-eyed people, right? These are being white, being black, being of a certain nationality, being tall or short. These are all characteristics. And they would put you in a category. You'd say all the people who are left-handed, raise your hand. Which I forget. Okay, so, but you don't necessarily know each other, so you don't form a group. But groups do and can form based on categories if people have common interests and they come together consciously. So maybe you have a left-handed society club, let's say at school, or a chess club, right? So you all play chess, you're in the same category, and then somebody puts up a notice and you'll say, oh, look, there's a chess club. Then you come together, you meet each other, and you interact regularly, and you feel a sense of unity, and boom, you're a group. And sometimes an aggregate can become a group. So, for example, if people are in the same place, like let's say 10 people get on an elevator, right? They don't know each other. They're just an aggregate of 10 people on an elevator. right? Under normal circumstances, they would each get off at their floor. They would never see each other again, right? But what if the elevator gets stuck for 5, 6, 7 hours, right? Now they're in a common situation, and believe me, they will probably form some type of group in those circumstances, maybe several groups. So other things that are not quite a social group, a crowd. So a crowd is a temporary cluster of people. They can have a temporal status. So for example, the crowd might become united in a way that they're all chanting for the same team, and they may feel a bond if they're all, Manchester United, right? So you can say, are they a group? Well, I would say not, because they don't really know each other, and they're not really going to have ongoing relations. So sometimes you have a crowd of people at a football stadium, a rock concert, a political rally, and but they're not really quite a social group, because they don't create an interaction on a regular basis. But a crowd may become a group if they feel a unity, but obviously it's a very large group. The feeling of unity is going to be somewhat dispersed. A crowd that begins to riot might be considered a group, but again, I mean, people would argue differently about that. Some people would say that it's usually more likely that groups will emerge within the crowd, and that will help direct some of the crowd activities. Now, different types of groups. So first of all, primary groups. These are typically the social groups where people share personal, lasting relations, long-term relations. So primary, because these are usually the groups we are first members of in our life, and these help form our life experience because they help internalize our value structure and who we are. So typically they're very small, they're personally oriented, they're oriented around the individual, and enduring. So they again last maybe an entire lifetime, or at least for a long time. They have no end point. Typically these are the first types of groups we experience in our lives, and they often give us an irreplaceable sense of self. So they usually become the core foundation of who we think we are. And again, these often provide all types of assistance, from emotional to financial to practical, and so on and so forth. So for example, the family, peer groups, particularly early peer groups in childhood. Although later peer groups may also be very influential, maybe people we meet in college, typically people we meet during transition periods. Again, when we transition from high school to college, we create a whole new set of peer groups, and they begin to encompass the previous peer groups. Secondary groups are much larger, typically larger impersonal social groups, where members are united more by a specific goal or activity. So typically there's a large membership, it's goal or activity oriented, and typically the rules are very formal, and there's a structure of etiquette, how to behave with other members of the group. Secondary relationships tend to have weak emotional ties, and they tend to be, as they get said, goal focused, so they're more short term. The overall thing may be ongoing. So for example, the best example of a secondary group is probably your workplace, right? So you don't know everybody at your workplace, but in some sense you're all united as a group, you're interacting, but a lot of the interaction is still anonymous. You have a sense of unity because you're all working for the same company, but you don't really know all the members of the group, right? So you don't have strong emotional ties with them, And typically the goals are short term. Let's get this done, then let's get this done, then let's get this done. Although, of course, if it's job based, your personal goal may be career length, right? Other types of secondary groups, maybe political organizations, maybe your religious organization that you're a member of, maybe social clubs that you're a member of. So these things themselves will be secondary groups, and they have a different type of organization. Now, every group will have some type of leadership. In other words, some way in which decision making is made, right? Typically involves somebody taking the lead, right? There's very few realities where a group is really purely democratic. Almost every group there'll be a certain people who rise up or are appointed to be the leaders. And typically there are two roles of a leader. One is instrumental, or the task-oriented role. The task-oriented role is to make sure that the group stays focused on the task, right? So if you're a rowing team, you got to row as fast as possible. Somebody has to be in charge to make sure you're going in the right direction, right? And hopefully going faster than the other teams, right? So that's your task-oriented leader. He may not necessarily be popular. That's not necessary for a task-oriented leader. He's simply there to make sure that the group is going in the right direction. The other type of leadership role is expressive. This type of role is focusing on the group as a group and making sure that members of the group feel a bond, right? So the expressive is more emotional, the instrumental is more formal and goal-oriented. And this means that very often different people within the group will actually take these different roles. So one person will tend to be the instrumental or task-oriented leader, and another person will tend to be the emotional or expressive leader, keeping the group together. It's very rare that one person is good at both of those. But in order to be a really good leader, you should be able to do both of those. Now, different leadership styles, this is more from the instrumental point of view. It could be either one, really. Authoritarian. So some people, basically, they want to make the decisions, and they basically just want everybody else to go along with them. So they're the authority, right? I'm in charge, just do what I say. The second type is more democratic. The democratic leader wants to get people involved, say, what do you think? What do you think? It may not be a matter of voting on every decision. Typically, he'll still make, he's still responsible for the ultimate decision, but he wants to get input from other people. The laissez-faire leader, laissez-faire is French for let it be, which we talked about earlier. And basically, this kind of leader just let everybody do whatever they want, or not whatever they want, but let everybody do what they do best, and we'll work together, right? It'll work out. So one of the effects of groups is conformity. So the idea is that the group tends to enforce a certain level of conformity on its members. And by this, I don't just mean authoritarian groups. Yes, the leader may tell everybody, you have to do what I say. That's an authoritarian group. But even in democratic and even laissez-faire groups, there may be group pressure. So you may, for example, you're sitting at a meeting, and let's say everybody else says, I think the best idea is to do Project A. And maybe you feel Project A is really not a good idea, but since everybody else agrees, you feel pressured to go along, right? So this is what Janice talks about as one of the negative sides of groupthink. The tendency that in a group, individuals kind of give up, or they're less likely to point out differences of opinion, particularly when the group seems to be united, right? So this often creates a situation where people just go along with the flow, and even though they have some misgivings, they don't bring them up. And it can create a lot of problems. For example, you may have heard of the Bay of Pigs, when America supported an invasion of Cuba in 1961. And everybody was like around the table kind of discussing, should we do this? Because, you know, were these people, were they ready to invade? Would people in Cuba really accept them? So there was kind of like the story, yeah, they'll invade and the people in Cuba will rise up and they'll overthrow, at that time, Fidel Castro, right? And even though things seemed to change, the group thing went along and people didn't want to bring up objections. So they went ahead and it was a total disaster. The troops landed and there was no support. There were many troops because they assumed that they'd get support from the local population. And Fidel Castro's troops just came down and wiped them out. So it was a huge disaster, big mistake. And but these things happen on a regular case in these types of group situations. So one of these is research done by a guy named Ash, which basically, I'll explain it in the next slide. It dealt with lines. The other research experiment of Milgram, we already talked about before, with Milgram's experiment of authority. So when the authority figure was there, it put a huge amount of pressure and people felt like they had to go along. But even more pressure when you had other people who they thought were just regular people like them, who went along. And in those cases, the subjects went along in even more cases. They felt it was, if they were willing to rebel against authority, but if all these other people agreed with the authority, then they were much less likely to rebel. This was the experiment done by Solomon Asch. So, for example, he would have a group of students in a classroom, let's say 10 students, right? And they were all asked, like in a public conversation, okay, look at these lines, right? Here you have card 1, and here's card 2. And you have 3 options, A, B, and C. Right? Now look at it. Which one do you think is the same length as card 1? Right? So, you have no group pressure on you. Just say the truth. What do you think? B? C? Well, obviously you'd say A, right? But this is the thing. In the room, he had 9 people who were accomplices, and they would say, instead of A, they would say B. All 9 of them. Right? And in those situations, you had one person who was the real subject. The idea was to see what would he say. Would he go along with the group and say B, or would he use his own eyes and say A? Right? Well, what do you think? Well, again, remember Milgram's experiment. Most of the people said B. Right? They said B. They went along with the group rather than going with their own senses. And you say, why? Were they intimidated? Or maybe they just assumed they needed glasses. And they're like, well, it looks like B to me, but everybody else says A, so I'll just say A so we don't have a problem. Right? So lots of reasons go into this, and maybe they just don't want to have a long discussion. It may be that they genuinely feel that they must be wrong if everybody else is saying something different. So the point of this is not just whether or not we agree with something wrong. It's just the general idea of how social pressure influences us on such a regular basis. So imagine if people, the point here is that if people are willing to go against their own senses of what is obviously true in their own eyes, but they're willing to deny it because the group says something different, then imagine all the ways the groups influence us in all these minor ways, right? Like what kind of clothes to wear, what kind of music to listen to, what kind of political opinions to have, right? Now, it may be very easy to say, well, I'm a Republican, I don't care, everybody else in my group is a Democrat, so obviously they will affect me. Well, we're not talking about your group now, but as you grow up, right? And even now, there may be many situations where you feel like, well, I'm not going to raise my disagreements because I don't want to get into an argument, or I don't want people to think of me in a certain way. So again, going back to Janice, the idea of groupthink, that people do things that end up being bad decision making. Again, normally we say two heads are better than one, but when you have a group of maybe 6, 7 people, if they get complacent, now this is not the way the group is supposed to work, perhaps, right? They're supposed to, so what leaders need to do is make sure that the group raises objections, right? The people feel free to raise objections. Unfortunately, many groups that occur in businesses and everyday situations, people don't want to raise objections. They don't want to rock the boat. They maybe assume that other people know more than they actually know, right? So the dynamics of the group can be positive. It can help people work together and think together. But it can also, the point is, it can also be negative, right? And I gave an example earlier about the Bay of Pigs, but this is another example. For example, Vietnam. How do we get sucked into Vietnam? And again, it was a matter of people just assuming that everybody else in the room must be correct. That, yeah, okay, the Vietnamese are going to give up. We just have to send 5,000 more troops, 10,000 more troops, 50,000 more troops, until we got into a situation where we couldn't get out of it without losing face. The space shuttle example is based on the Space Shuttle Challenger, which was exploded on launch. This is during the 1980s. And in the investigation, they found out it exploded because a rubber ring, literally a rubber ring, like that size, worth 5 cents, failed. And they found out that been a lot of people had been concerned about this issue, but nobody had quite raised it. So they'd gone ahead with this launch when somebody should have raised their hand and said, wait, maybe we shouldn't do this. But there was so much group pressure to do the launch. There was a lot of politics behind it. The President Reagan was pushing to get a launch done so that he would look good. There was going to be a teacher on the shuttle. They had all the students ready. They didn't want to disappoint the students. So because of this, at the end of the day, a 5-cent piece of hardware ended up killing 9 people and destroying billions and billions of dollars of equipment. To say nothing of all those school kids watching their teacher blow up in front of their faces. That wasn't very nice either. So reference group is another way of thinking about a group. A reference group is not necessarily a real group. The reference group is the kind of the pseudo group we think of when we're referring to other people, right? It's like the other, right? So when we think of the us, that's us, our group. The other, that's sometimes everybody else, sometimes specific other groups. So for example, when we think of keeping up with the Joneses, right? We want to keep up with it. What does that mean? Well, we think in our mind like people who are better off than us, not massively better. Like we would never try to compare ourselves with Bill Gates, right? But we might say, well, look, our neighbors have the same job and yet they've got a better car, or they have a nicer house, or they have a better garden, or their kids are nicer, right? So this pressure, when we refer to other groups, can create pressure internally on us to do things we might not otherwise do. And then there's the in-group and the out-group. So the in-group, like I said, is the us. The out-group is everybody else. Now, one of the features of group behavior, and this works on the level of the small group, the large group, the secondary group, even the nation state, is that unity within the group is heightened if there's a perception of threat from outside the group, right? So the out group is often seen as either a threat or something that we make fun of. Oh, look at them. We're so much better than them. So we feel better because we're better than we make fun of them. Or they're a threat, we feel threatened. And very often if they're a threat, we tend to see them as evil and inhuman, right? So the out group is that reference group that we tend to think of as particularly abhorrent to our in group, right? So again, it may be a simple matter of teams, our team versus your team. And then the larger version of that is our high school versus your high school. Sometimes that becomes kind of a big deal, right? When there's a historic, maybe long-term feud between different colleges or schools, right? Other times it may be just a joke, right? It's like, oh, you're the math club, we're the language club, right? Oh, we're better than you because we're better at math. No, we're better than you because we can explain things better. But in some circumstances, when you start to see the other group as a threat, you may make fun of them. They become an object of, or they may even become inhuman. So, for example, in wartime, countries very often create a propaganda image of the enemy as a kind of a monster, right? So, and again, this is very normal in a certain way because it's a product of the overarching buildup of loyalty and unity within the in-group. But it can create many problems. It may mean that people go overboard in their hatred for the other group, so it can create the tendency towards violence or unabashed violence. Particularly if the other group is present as a minority, maybe people go and they attack them or they blame them for what the outside group is doing. So when Japan attacked America at the beginning of World War II, there was a lot of reaction against Japanese Americans in the United States. I mean, obviously there had already previously been a lot of racism too. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So these are problematic issues in, I wouldn't say human nature necessarily, but in human group formation. Another very interesting aspect of group is group size and how group size affects group dynamics. So for example, if you have a dyad, that's two people. A dyad may be very intimate, but it's like when you have boyfriend-girlfriend situation or a young married couple, sometimes the intimacy is too much and it becomes very unstable, right? So they're very relatively fragile because they may, if they face a pressure from outside, the very intimacy of the relationship also creates, well, a lot of hostility or potential issues, right? Now a triad is a three-member group. So when two parents have a child, they become a triad. Not really a full-fledged triad because the child very often at first is not really a full-grown, obviously, group member. But as the child grows up, then you have a triad. And what happens with the triad is it's more stable because you have three members. They don't necessarily, it's not necessarily as intimate, the relationship, because you're dividing your attention, each person is dividing their attention between two, but it also allows some variation of relationships so that you don't get the same level of intensity that can sometimes create breakup. So as the number of people in a group increases, there are two basic phenomena. One is the number of relationships increase, right? So if you have two people, it's only one relationship. So everything's in that one basket. Three people have three potential relationships, right? A to B, B to C, A to C. Four people have six relationships. So you notice here, the number of relationships is going up diametrically. 5 people have 10 relationships. 6 people have 15 relationships. And 7 people, as you can see, have 21 relationships. Now, this is what happens because the human brain is not really capable of understanding or incorporating within its view more than 6 things at a time, right? So when you get to the level of 7, the group becomes so complex that it generally splits, right? So you might notice this at a party. When a few people arrive at the party, there are 3 or 4, they're all in one area and they're all chatting, right? Another person comes, and they're probably going to be more like, some of the people in the group will start to sit back because 5 or 6, you already are starting to have a little trouble with conversation, particularly if some people are a little overbearing, right? And then when you get to usually 6, or especially the number 7, the group will almost invariably start dividing into subgroups, right? That's because we can't really organize or acknowledge a conversation with 7 people at the same time. So that's why we have, at that point, formal organizations and formal rules, right? So Robert's Rules of Order is a procedure by which you decide who gets to talk next. What's the order of discussion, as it were, right? You don't need that when it's just 3 or 4 people. But when you have 7 or 8 people around the table, suddenly you need to have somebody make the decision about who goes next, right? And you need formal procedures, right, in order to make sure people don't get left out of the conversation. So why are the relationships in small groups more intense? Because there are less relationships, right? And again, if you've ever been in love, it's great. You're in love. That one person is like the be-all and end-all of your existence, and you're the be-all and end-all of their existence, assuming they love you too, right? But it's very hard, you'll notice, to maintain that intensity. It actually becomes destructive, right? And people who do try to maintain that intensity are usually going to get the other people very annoyed because it's crazy, right? You can't do that. You have to have other relationships. You have to talk to other people, right? So if you have a boyfriend or girlfriend, they're like, no, I only want you to talk to me. Don't talk to anybody else. Don't talk to your mom. Don't talk to your dad. Only I'm important. It's like, okay, maybe just think about moving on. So when we talk about groups, again, in society, there are many different types of groups, all the way from the small level, the family, the peer group, and generally the smaller the group, generally the more homogeneous it's going to be. And homogeneity has its own features. When everybody in the group is very similar, like people at a church, particularly at a cult, right, where they select members who are very similar in terms of outlook, not necessarily in terms of other features, they will tend to turn inward, and it reinforces this kind of sense of unity within the group. They'll very much distrust outsiders because outsiders, they don't understand us. We understand each other because we're in a group like this, right? But the people outside that group don't understand us. When you have groups that are more heterogeneous, I don't just mean in terms of race or class or gender, but maybe in terms of attitude, they'll tend to look outward. They'll tend to be more accepting of new members. They promote more interaction with outsiders, right? social boundaries are also very important to think about. What is the boundary between the group and the non-group? Who's a member, who is not a member, right? Typically at any one time, particularly in a small group, everybody will know who the members are, right? Like, for example, you think of your friends, your friendship group in high school or junior high school maybe, you say, okay, these were my friends. You had Joey, Peter, Sam, Tom, and me. We were the 6 friends, or the 3 amigos, or whatever, right? So what if one of them leaves? At what point do they leave the group? Maybe they move to another state, right? They no longer interact on a regular basis. Are they still a member of the group? Well, the group has to decide that, but invariably over time, their ability to interact and maybe the fact that they will have new groups in their new home will mean they move on, right? And then again, when somebody new comes into the group, you don't necessarily accept them right away. You'd be like, this is Pete, he's a friend of mine. Well, he's a friend of yours, but he's not necessarily a member of the group yet, right? So when exactly does that happen? So it's very, very interesting how these things take place. So sometimes there are segregation, there are lines, for example, formal lines, just as we have in formal organizations. So, for example, segregation separated black people from white people as a policy. So you couldn't go to the same parks, you couldn't be members of the same clubs, you couldn't even eat together at the same restaurant, right? Because it was illegal for white people to go to black places and for black people to go to white places, right? So you have very limited contact, and this is going to create or reinforce that sense of group separation. The separation doesn't have to be absolute either. It may be based on roles. So in the case of racial segregation, whites and blacks very often interacted, but only in situations where they were clearly unequal. Then finally you have networks. And networks are something else which are actually becoming a very important area of study now. In the past, we talked about networks as webs of weak social ties. So for example, in your career, you know maybe many people as associates or colleagues, or they go to the same school as acquaintances. That's a word we might use. I know the person, I don't know him well. We're not friends. We're not a member of a close group. We're a member of a secondary group, or even further of a network. So I know him, and that means sometimes I might be able to go to them and get something. So having a network are those people who we know or could get to know, right? And therefore, there's the potential of interaction, right? So the larger the network you have, some people say, this gives you more power because it means more people you can create a relationship with when it's necessary. So some people say in order to have a successful career, don't focus on your group because that will limit you. Focus instead on your network because that will allow you to say, okay, I can approach this guy, he can give me this guy can give me this. And you think about it, modern society is kind of like a huge network, right? We go to the supermarket, we go to the workplace, go to the church, and we get different things from different places. And of course, we also have the internet, which creates a kind of a super network, because now we can potentially interact with anybody, and we can create networks within networks. So, for example, if you're interested in spiders, you can probably find many websites about spiders, social groups on the internet about spiders, and even though not a single person in your school would ever want to come to your house because you keep talking about creepy stuff like spiders, but yet you could have, tons of acquaintances and maybe even friends, close friends you meet through the internet because you share this particular interest. So the internet has created a lot of potential for new types of networks, new types of groups. to emerge, and that is an emerging area of research which unfortunately has not been completed. So thank you very much for your attention, and next lecture we'll be talking about large groups.